Sitting at the dimly lit corner booth of Chicago's most exclusive restaurant, the Velvet Room, I happened to casually glance up from my table. What I saw, or rather who I saw, was a heavily pregnant waitress struggling to carry a tray. Her face, framed by loose strands of exhausted hair, looked hauntingly, terrifyingly familiar. When she finally looked up and our eyes met across the crowded, opulent dining room, the breath completely vanished from my lungs. My heart seemed to violently freeze inside my chest. It was my daughter-in-law, the very same woman my son had vehemently sworn abandoned him and ran away 8 months prior. The second she recognized my face illuminated by the candlelight, sheer, unadulterated panic washed over her features, and she immediately turned and practically ran away. I abandoned my multi-million-dollar dinner and chased after her into the freezing night, desperate to uncover the truth. But the dark, horrifying reality she revealed to me in that freezing alleyway completely shattered the foundation of my entire world. That single answer exposed a massive, suffocating web of deceit I had been completely blind to for the past 8 months. Before I reveal the horrifying betrayal that tore my family apart and changed my life forever, please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and share your thoughts in the comments section down below. Where are you tuning in from today? No matter where you are in the world, please prioritize your health and well-being. Note: this is a dramatized narrative crafted specifically to deeply explore the themes of corporate greed, family betrayal, and ultimate survival. However, the message and lessons it carries hold genuine, real-world significance. Now let us continue. The solid gold fountain pen in my hand felt as heavy as a lead weight. For a brief, terrifying second, the $3.5 million commercial acquisition contract sitting on the polished mahogany table blurred into a chaotic, dizzying smear of black ink and expensive, watermarked paper. I am Arthur Sterling. At 62 years old, the immense, crushing pressure of my commercial real estate empire felt like it was physically pressing down on my shoulders as I sat in the low, atmospheric light of the Velvet Room. Usually, the rich aromas of dry-aged steak, expensive red wine, and freshly polished floors invigorated me. They were the sensory signals of an impending victory, the smell of success. But tonight, that same atmosphere only amplified the bitter nausea rising and clawing at the back of my throat. My hands, which had spent decades hauling concrete, hoisting steel beams, and drafting the blueprints for Chicago's tallest, most iconic skyscrapers, were suddenly betraying me. A distinct, uncontrollable tremor made the gold nib of the fountain pen dance and skip wildly over the dotted signature line. It was a humiliating, terrifying physical vulnerability I had spent the last 6 months desperately trying to hide from the world. It was a recurring, mysterious sickness that made the extravagant winter solstice decorations of the restaurant spin around me like a dizzying, mocking carousel of red ribbons and flickering candlelight. Sitting directly across the table from me was Richard Vance, my trusted business partner of 22 years. He sat there watching me, his 58-year-old face tightened with the distinct, arrogant impatience of a man who only cared about adding the next zero to his offshore bank statement. He shifted uncomfortably in his tailored seat, his expensive silk tie catching the dazzling light from the crystal chandeliers above us. "Arthur, you have been staring blankly at that dotted line for a solid 4 minutes," Richard muttered, his voice sharp, slicing right through the elegant, hushed murmur of the dining room. "Are we having a problem with the valuation numbers?" I blinked hard, desperately trying to force the swimming figures and letters back into sharp alignment. "It's just the ambient lighting in here, Richard," I managed to choke out, my voice sounding incredibly frail and thin, even to my own ears. "My vision just isn't quite what it used to be." I took a sharp, incredibly shallow breath, trying to anchor my spinning senses to the cold, solid, heavy weight of the pen in my grip. I was the undisputed king of Sterling Innovations. I was a man with $60 million sitting comfortably in liquid assets. And yet, sitting in that plush leather booth, I felt like a man who was drowning in a thimble of water. How could someone with that much absolute power and wealth feel so utterly defenseless? The edges of the room began to tilt, the expensive floral wallpaper fraying into a hazy, gray shadow. I just needed to sign the paper. I needed to finish this deal and close this acquisition before my legs gave out completely and the world dissolved into the floorboards. But then a heavy, laborious dragging sound approached the periphery of our booth. It wasn't the swift, invisible Lee GHT-footed glide of the high-end waitstaff that usually worked here. It was a slow, agonizing, deliberate shuffle that carried a weary caution, demanding my attention. A server stepped into the soft glow of our table's candlelight. She moved with a profound physical struggle that violently clashed with the relaxed, wealthy patrons casually dining around us. Her frail frame was straining immensely to support a pregnant belly that looked far too heavy for her delicate, slender shoulders. I opened my mouth, preparing to request a glass of ice water to soothe my dizziness and clear my foggy head. But as I raised my head to look at her, the air completely vanished from my lungs. Clara Hayes, just 27 years old, stood before me looking like the hollowed-out ghost of the vibrant woman I once knew. She wore a stained, oversized apron over her 8-month pregnant figure, every slight movement visibly exhausting her to her core. This was the exact same woman my son, Julian, had vehemently sworn was a manipulative, heartless gold digger. He told our entire family she had drained their joint accounts, run off to Paris with another man, and vanished for good. Yet here she was, standing less than 3 feet away from my glass. My heart began to hammer a painful, frantic rhythm against my ribcage. The dizzying fog in my brain instantly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, icy spike of recognition and adrenaline that cut through my illness. "Good evening, gentlemen," she whispered. Her voice was a fragile, trembling thread as she deliberately stared down at the table, doing everything in her power to avoid making direct eye contact with me. "May I start you off with some sparkling water while you review the menu?" My grip on the fountain pen tightened until my knuckles turned completely white, the metal biting into my skin. "Water," I rasped, the single word barely scraping past my paralyzed vocal cords. "Just ice water." The woman my own flesh and blood claimed had fled the country for another lover was standing right in front of me, in her 3rd trimester, trembling from fatigue, carrying a heavy tray of water in a restaurant where I happened to own a 50% stake. As she set the crystal glass down on the table, her hands shook so violently that the water rippled, sending frantic, chaotic reflections that matched the wild hammering inside my chest. I sat utterly frozen, my hand still gripping the gold pen over a multi-million-dollar contract that suddenly felt as worthless as a piece of scrap paper. Clara Hayes had once been the brightest, most sharp-witted and warmest presence at all of our Sunday family dinners. She had helped me navigate complex corporate audits with effortless grace. Now, she was reduced to a frightened phantom in a dirty apron. Despite her obvious, paralyzing fear of being seen by me, she had still approached the table. Looking deeply into her hollow, bruised eyes, I realized she was either so blinded by sheer, crushing exhaustion that she hadn't recognized me until she was inches away, or she was silently, desperately begging for a lifeline she was too terrified to ask for out loud. For 8 long months, my son Julian had painted her as the ultimate villain. Yet here she was, heavily pregnant and serving expensive salads to the very socialites Julian claimed she had victimized. Across the table, Richard continued to babble on and on about asset depreciation, interest rates, and equity splits. His voice faded into a distant, annoying white noise that I completely ignored. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that the infamous runaway daughter-in-law he'd gossiped so much about was standing mere inches from his expensive steak. I stared at her, desperately searching for the vibrant woman I remembered. Her eyes were rimmed with a deep, bruised fatigue that no amount of sleep could ever fix. "Clara," I breathed her name, the syllables feeling incredibly heavy and foreign on my tongue. "Is that really you?" Her eyes darted up to mine for a fraction of a second. In that brief, agonizing glance, I saw a cocktail of pure, raw, unadulterated terror and a silent, pleading silence that completely fractured my heart. I am just your server tonight, sir," she stammered, her voice a reedy, broken echo of the confident tone I remembered. "Please, I will fetch your salads immediately. You must understand, I spent 40 years building sterling innovations by adhering to one strict, unbreakable rule. Never, ever walk away from the table until the ink on the contract is dry." But in that exact second, the millions of dollars felt like dirt and ash. I watched Clara turn to leave. Her hands were shaking so severely that she accidentally dropped a polished silver butter knife. It clattered loudly against the hard marble tile, the sharp ring of metal drawing immediate, judgmental sneers and glares from the wealthy couple sitting in the next booth. She didn't even attempt to bend down and retrieve it. She simply turned and practically limped toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen, her heavy pregnancy making her uneven gait highlight the agonizing physical toll of her situation. The sight of her struggling, her pale knuckles turning white as she gripped that serving tray, ignited a blazing inferno of protective, paternal fury inside me that burned away the last remnants of my mysterious dizziness. "Arthur, for heaven's sake, you look like you've just seen a ghost," Richard snapped, his tone laced with deep annoyance, finally noticing my completely shattered composure. "Are you having another one of your dizzy spells? Focus, Arthur, look at the numbers. We need this signature tonight." I stared down at the $3.5 million agreement, and then looked back toward the swinging kitchen doors where Clara had disappeared. She was a wounded, trapped bird trying to navigate a hurricane of crystal chandeliers and elitist, judgmental whispers. "I think I just saw a ghost, Richard," I said, my tone vibrating with a sudden, lethal, and absolute authority. "Stay seated right here. Do not follow me." I shoved the heavy leather chair back, physically pushing the massive, expensive contract aside with such force that it nearly slid off the edge of the mahogany table. Ignoring Richard's bewildered protests and the floor manager's panicked cry of "Mr. Sterling, wait," I broke the sacred, unwritten boundary of the fine dining floor. I marched right past the velvet ropes and threw open the swinging kitchen doors, leaving the refined atmosphere of clinking wine glasses and soft music behind. I stepped instantly into the chaotic belly of the beast. The refined scent of expensive lilies and aged wine was violently replaced by a blast of humid heat and the stinging, acrid stench of industrial bleach and heavy degreaser. My expensive Italian loafers slipped slightly on the grease-stained tiles as I ignored the shocked gasps of the line cooks and the roaring hiss of the commercial dishwashers. Marco, the 39-year-old executive chef who normally ruled this kitchen like it was his own personal kingdom, stepped backwards the moment he saw the look of pure murder in my eyes. He opened his mouth, starting to protest, ready to defend his culinary territory. "Get out of my way, Marco," I growled, my voice cutting through the culinary chaos like a serrated blade before he could even utter a word. "I am not here for a health inspection." My eyes rapidly scanned the chaotic stainless steel landscape, looking past the barking orders, the flames, and the clatter of heavy pans, until they finally locked onto a dark, shadowed corner near the walk-in freezer and prep station. Clara was huddled there. She was leaning her heavy frame against a stainless steel counter, her face buried deep in her shaking hands. The physical reality of her situation was a brutal, staggering punch to my gut. A woman in her 8th month of pregnancy, forced to stand for grueling double shifts on hard, slippery floors while surrounded by roaring stoves that felt like open furnaces. She had taken a job at the most high-profile restaurant in Chicago, a brilliant, desperate, and terrifying gamble, hiding in plain sight right under my son's arrogant nose. "Clara, look at me," I commanded softly, my voice losing its edge as I closed the distance between us. "This nightmare ends right now." She flinched violently, as if my words were a physical strike. Her eyes darted wildly around the kitchen, exhibiting the frantic, panicked paranoia of a hunted animal trapped in a cage. She suddenly reached out, grabbed the sleeve of my tailored blazer, and pulled me with surprising, adrenaline-fueled strength toward a narrow, dimly lit hallway near the dry storage room. The air in the confined space smelled strongly of burnt garlic, dried oregano, and stale flour. How do you convince a woman who is petrified of your own flesh and blood that she is entirely safe in your presence? I was the man who had raised and funded the monster she was desperately hiding from. Looking down at her white-knuckled grip on my jacket, I saw it. This wasn't just standard fear. It was a bone-deep, marrow-deep, absolute certainty that my son was the villain of her story. "Julian told everyone you left him for someone else," I whispered, the lie tasting like battery acid and poison on my tongue. "He told the board, he told the family, that you drained the accounts, took everything and fled to Europe." Clara let out a ragged, breathless sound that was halfway between a hysterical sob and a broken laugh. "If he finds out I'm still in the city, Arthur, if he finds out about the baby, he'll take him. He will lock me away, declare me unfit, and I'll never ever see my child again." Her voice was a frantic, ragged hiss against the constant hum of the massive refrigerators. In the span of 3 minutes, she completely dismantled the narrative I had been fed. Julian hadn't just driven her away with cruel words. He had actively and systematically threatened to have her committed to a psychiatric ward, aiming to seize full, sole custody of their unborn child solely to secure his status as the primary heir to the sterling real estate empire. My own son had weaponized the very family legacy and wealth I had spent my entire life building, using it to enslave and torture his wife. I stood frozen in the narrow pantry, gripping a cold metal shelving unit just to keep myself upright as the entire foundation of my reality collapsed around me. "He doesn't want a family, Arthur. He doesn't want a son to love. He wants a corporate bargaining chip," she begged, tears finally carving paths through the grease and exhaustion on her pale cheeks. "If you ever loved me like a daughter, please, pretend you never saw me. Don't let him know I'm alive." I looked at her trembling frame, then looked back at the swinging wooden doors. The monster that caused this immense suffering was my own creation. Every second we stood in this dark corner, Julian was out there living in unearned luxury while she starved. The distant sound of Richard calling my name from the dining room snapped me back to a present reality that simply no longer mattered. The $3.5 million acquisition meant absolutely nothing now. I didn't even look back at my stunned partner or the contract. I stripped off my heavy cashmere overcoat, letting it catch on a chair as I lunged toward the heavy metal service exit door. The transition was a violent physical blow to my senses. We traded the 70-degree warmth of the kitchen for the brutal 15-degree chill of a Chicago winter night. Philip, the 42-year-old floor manager who possessed a permanent, elitist sneer for his underpaid staff, stepped into my path with a look of practiced, oily concern. "Mr. Sterling, sir, you really can't be back here," he began, his voice dripping with unearned authority. I didn't stop. I shoved right past him, my shoulder connecting with his chest just hard enough to send him stumbling backward into a stainless steel prep table. "Save it for the corporate lawyers, Richard," I shouted back toward the dining room, just as the heavy metal alley door clanged shut behind me. Stepping out of the restaurant was a massive shock. My lungs burned fiercely as I inhaled the frigid, icy air. The opulent, expensive smells of the velvet room were instantly replaced by the disgusting stench of rotting garbage, wet cardboard, and frozen vehicle exhaust. By walking out of those doors, I was actively and intentionally sabotaging the most important financial negotiation of the fiscal year. But as the freezing wind whipped through my hair, the money felt like worthless paper scraps. For 40 years, I was Arthur Sterling, the man who closed every deal and never left the table. Tonight, I was just a desperate grandfather trying to chase a ghost through the frost to save his bloodline. How many times had I sat in that very same restaurant, eating $600 steaks, while my unborn grandson was being sustained on whatever scraps his mother could afford. The thought was a jagged, bleeding edge in my throat. "Clara, stop!" I called out into the dim, lightless alleyway. There, huddled in the deep shadows beside a rusted, frozen dumpster, I spotted her. She was gasping for breath, leaning against the damp brick wall. Her thin cotton uniform offered absolutely zero protection against the biting winter wind. Her arms were wrapped fiercely and defensively around her swollen stomach, her body racking with violent, silent shivers. "Please, Clara, I am not here to hurt you," I said, my voice cracking with emotion as I stepped carefully into the flickering, yellow glow of a single security lamp, keeping my hands visible and non-threatening. She looked up at me, and the sight of her blue-tinged lips and audibly chattering teeth made my stomach turn with nausea. "Mr. Sterling, Arthur, you shouldn't have followed me," she whispered, her tone a desperate, freezing rasp. "If Julian finds out, you have no idea what he will do." The lies my son told didn't just have layers, they had razor-sharp teeth. "Look at me, Clara," I demanded gently, stepping closer. "Tell me everything. Why did Julian tell everyone you robbed us?" She let out a hollow, shattered cry that sounded exactly like breaking glass. "He didn't just chase me out into the cold, Arthur. He systematically destroyed me. He went to Philip, the manager here. He told him I was a known thief. He said I stole from the family trust. He wanted me to be watched, even here. He wanted to make sure I had nowhere safe to go, no way to earn a respectable living." A wave of lethal, icy indignation washed over me. I tried to drape my heavy cashmere coat over her shivering shoulders, but she flinched away with a traumatic, instinctive jerk. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound and deeply rooted that it proved Julian's cruelty went far beyond verbal abuse and financial control. Standing in the freezing alley, as the wind bit into my face, Clara began to methodically dismantle the psychological torture chamber my son had turned their home into. Julian's verbal abuse, labeling her worthless and a gold digger, was just the surface. While Clara was pulling grueling 60-hour work weeks doing freelance tax consulting just to keep their mortgage afloat, Julian was executing a masterclass in gaslighting. She revealed the most horrifying detail. Vanessa Croft hadn't simply appeared after Clara had fled. Vanessa had been living inside their home, in the guest suite, for months prior to Clara leaving. She had moved in under the guise of being a corporate compliance consultant. "Arthur, he didn't hit me with his fists," she choked out, her teeth chattering so hard it sounded like dry bones clicking together. "He erased me. He made me feel like a ghost, like I didn't even exist in my own house." I leaned my weight against the freezing brick wall, my stomach churning violently. "Vanessa was living there, under the same roof, while you were still there?" I asked, my voice barely a rasp. Vanessa Croft wasn't just a random woman Julian met at a bar. She was a former senior compliance officer at my firm, whom I had personally investigated and fired for blatantly embezzling corporate funds. Julian had secretly gone behind my back, rehired her, and moved a known, calculated thief into his home to help him dismantle his own wife's sanity. Clara detailed a waking, living nightmare. Vanessa began brazenly wearing Clara's expensive clothes and jewelry while Clara was still living there. They would sit together at the dining table, drinking wine, completely ignoring Clara as if she were a piece of furniture, openly laughing and discussing their future plans together. "She wore the custom anniversary dress you bought me. She wore it to dinner inside my own house," Clara wept, her white-knuckled fingers gripping her pregnant belly so tightly I feared she might induce early labor. "And Julian just watched. He smiled. He encouraged it." "They were executing you slowly," I murmured, the righteous anger boiling in my veins turning into a terrifying, cold, and calculated fury. My son hadn't just had an affair. He had used the wealth I provided him to fund a domestic psychological execution. I reached out to steady her as another violent shiver racked her frail body. But as she looked at me, her eyes suddenly widened with a new, specific kind of dread. She stared at my pale, sweaty face, noting the tremor in my own hands that I had been hiding. "Arthur, Vanessa didn't just move in for Julian's money," she whispered, her tone dropping to a terrified, secretive hush, glancing over my shoulder toward the alley exit. "She brought small vials, powders, they joked. They joked that it was to help you retire early." A cold sweat that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing Chicago wind broke across the back of my neck. The word powders echoed in my mind, suddenly snapping the last 6 months of my mysterious, debilitating fatigue into horrifying focus. My world tilted wildly on its axis. The vertigo I had been battling wasn't the stress of running a massive empire. It wasn't the inevitable toll of old age or a failing heart. It was attempted murder. It was by design. My sudden, unexplainable dizzy spells, the metallic taste in my morning tea, the heavy lethargy that kept me bedridden during vital board meetings. It was all a meticulously planned biological attack. Clara's mention of the powders confirmed my darkest, unspoken fear. My own son was actively poisoning me. I tried to grab Clara's arm to support her, but her legs finally gave out before my fingers could gain purchase. She collapsed onto the snow-dusted, gravel-covered asphalt of the alley, clutching her stomach and gasping for air in a way that terrified me to my core. The freezing temperatures and the sheer psychological weight of her confession had finally broken the last remaining threads of her physical endurance. "Clara, stay with me. Look at me," I roared, the sound bouncing off the brick walls of the alley like a gunshot. I completely forgot about the multi-million-dollar contract inside. I ripped my phone from my pocket. "Samuel, bring the SUV to the alley exit. Right now," I screamed into the receiver, my voice cracking with a fierce, protective paternal desperation I hadn't felt since Julian was a child. Samuel Briggs, a 48-year-old ex-Marine who had driven for me for 20 years through multiple construction booms, didn't ask a single question. Within seconds, I heard the aggressive screech of heavy tires tearing around the frozen corner. My grandson was inside that shivering woman. My bloodline, my future was fading in the dirty snow while I stood there helpless. It was a brutal, gut-wrenching realization that eclipsed every real estate deal I had ever brokered in my life. I scooped Clara's frail body into my arms, horrified by how incredibly little. She weighed beneath her heavy coat and pregnancy, and laid her gently across the plush leather seats of my luxury SUV. The stark contrast between the pristine, warm leather and her stained, threadbare apron made me physically sick. Samuel tore through the icy Chicago streets, treating red lights as mere suggestions and ignoring the angry honks of lesser vehicles. I sat in the back, gripping Clara's freezing hand, terrified by how weak and clammy her pulse fluttered against my palm. The neon lights of the city blurred past the tinted windows in long, mocking streaks. We were in a race against a clock that Julian and Vanessa had rigged behind my back. "Don't you dare close your eyes, Clara. Your baby needs you. I need you," I commanded softly, my voice thick with protective fury. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open, glazed with pain and exhaustion. "Arthur, the powders. He stirs them into your morning tea," she mumbled, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. She confessed that Vanessa had arrogantly bragged about the specific industrial chemical supplier she used to purchase the toxins, assuming Clara was too emotionally broken to ever piece it together or remember. The automatic sliding doors of Northwestern Memorial's emergency room hissed open, flooding my senses with the stark smell of clinical antiseptic and sterilized floor wax. I didn't wait for the orderlies or a gurney. I carried her through the sliding doors myself, bellowing for immediate assistance under the blinding fluorescent lights until a swarm of scrubs descended upon us, pulling her onto a stretcher and whisking her away into the sterile unknown. I paced the cold linoleum of the waiting room, staring at the smear of grease and dirt on the sleeve of my $4,000 tailored suit. My ears rang with the rhythmic squeak of rubber shoes on the floor. The intake nurse quietly informed me that Clara had actually visited this exact ER 3 months ago. However, she had fled before seeing a doctor because she spotted one of Julian's corporate lackeys in the lobby. She had been living like a hunted fugitive in my own city, while I was busy celebrating quarterly profits. Dr. Evelyn Carter, a 55-year-old OBGYN with the exhausted, compassionate eyes of someone who fought for lives daily, finally stepped into the waiting area. "Is my grandson? Is he alive?" I asked, my voice cracking and dry as ash. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping as her expression softened just enough to let me breathe. "The baby is a fighter, Mr. Sterling, but his mother is dangerously depleted, running on absolute empty. She is suffering from severe clinical dehydration, stage 1 anemia, and extreme caloric deficit. She hasn't had a proper, nutritious meal in days. She has been starving herself to ensure the baby gets nutrients." The medical confirmation of her neglect felt like a physical sledgehammer to my chest. My grandson was surviving by literally draining the last reserves of his mother's life. I had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, yet I had allowed the foundation of my own family to rot in the gutters of the city. I absolutely refused to leave Clara in a general public ward where Julian's spies might locate her. Throwing my weight, influence, and checkbook around, I had her discharged under a fictitious pseudonym. "Use the underground service elevator, Samuel," I instructed in a hushed whisper as we snuck her out of the hospital's bowels. "We don't exist tonight. No one sees her enter." We drove straight to the Drake Hotel. I bypassed the front desk entirely and took her directly to Suite 55, the opulent presidential suite I kept on permanent retainer for visiting foreign investors and tech moguls. At $6,000 a night, it was a fortress of absolute luxury. I locked down the entire floor, ensuring housekeeping and maintenance were barred from entry. Clara was effectively a ghost inside Chicago's most famous hotel. I sat in a plush velvet armchair, watching as she finally fell into a deep, uninterrupted sleep amidst the high thread count linens. The dry, recycled hum of the suite's climate control was the only sound in the room. Her pale face finally lost its mask of terror, sinking into the deep pillows. "You are untouchable now, Clara," I whispered to the quiet room, adjusting the heavy silk duvet. "I swear it." As I sat there in the dim light of 2:00 a.m., the blood drying scratchy on my wool cuff, a terrifying, cold, and calculated rage began to solidify in my chest. I wasn't the tired, sick old man anymore. I was an architect staring at the compromised blueprints of my son's life, preparing to demolish it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Julian. "Dad, Richard said you ran out of the restaurant. Did you have another dizzy spell? Do you need me to call the home nurse?" He was mocking me, checking the pulse of his slow-motion murder while I sat guarding the wreckage of the victims he had discarded. When the morning sun finally broke over Lake Michigan, casting a harsh, clinical light across the glass towers of Chicago, I prepared for a war I never wanted to fight. I didn't announce my arrival or call ahead. I simply drove to Julian's ultra-modern glass penthouse, leaned my entire weight heavily on the doorbell, and waited. The vibration echoed the cold, rhythmic thumping of my heart. Julian Sterling, 36 years old, answered the door wearing a designer silk robe, holding a steaming mug of artisanal espresso. He carried an air of unearned superiority, looking entirely inconvenienced by my presence rather than concerned. "Dad, what are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice adopting that sickeningly smooth, patronizing tone. "You look dreadful, Mitchell. Are you having another episode? You really need to be resting in bed with a nurse, not wandering the streets." It was the exact same psychological gaslighting he used on Clara. Subtle, constant remarks designed to make me feel senile, fragile, and weak. "I came to see exactly when the soul inside you died, Julian," I said, pushing my way past him into the sprawling, minimalist living room. The penthouse was a monument to sterile extravagance, acres of white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, but it felt completely devoid of human warmth. I spotted 2 coffee cups on the kitchen island and a pair of discarded designer heels by the sofa. The smell of bitter espresso hung heavy in the air, a scent that made my stomach churn with the memory of Clara's revelation about the powders. Vanessa Croft, 33, was lounging on the imported Italian leather couch. She was wearing a silk robe that I recognized instantly. It was a piece I had bought for Clara. Vanessa offered me a thin, reptilian smile that held absolutely zero remorse. "Good morning, Arthur," she purred, her voice laced with fake, artificial sweetness. "Lovely to see you're still standing upright today." Looking at her, I saw the exact same greedy junior compliance officer I had fired years ago for forging expense reports. Now, she was wearing my daughter-in-law's clothes, drinking from her cups, living her life, and actively plotting my funeral. The soft, arrogant rustle of her silk robe as she crossed her legs was a physical slap to my face. "Where is she, Julian? Where is Clara?" I demanded, gripping the cold, smooth edge of the marble countertop to mask the very real fury trembling in my hands. Julian shared a conspiratorial, amused smirk with Vanessa before walking over to his mahogany desk. He picked up a thick manila folder and practically strutted back to me, leaning against the counter. "I was trying to spare your fragile heart, Dad," he sighed dramatically, sliding the folder across the cold marble with a flourish. "But your sweet, precious Clara didn't just walk out on me. She embezzled from us. She's been siphoning cash from Sterling Innovations for the last 10 months. Here's the proof." My own flesh and blood looked me dead in the eyes, handed me a packet of poorly forged lies outlining his own crimes, and fully expected my deteriorating brain to accept it. Whatever remaining paternal loyalty and affection I held for him died in that exact moment, replaced by a ruthless, calculating wrath that he wouldn't understand until it was too late. I didn't even touch the folder. Instead, a low, dry laugh rumbled in my chest, echoing off the expensive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. It was the laugh of a man who finally understood the punchline of a very dark joke. Julian's smug grin faltered. He shot a nervous glance at Vanessa, clearly unscripted for this reaction. "Let me get this straight, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the room, dropping to a dangerous metallic register. "You are telling me that a freelance tax consultant managed to steal nearly $1 million from right under your nose. If that is true, you are vastly more incompetent than I ever feared. By your own logic, you completely failed to protect the firm's liquidity. Consider yourself officially terminated as vice president, effective immediately." His jaw dropped. He had completely miscalculated. He thought I would be devastated by Clara's betrayal. He never expected me to use it as a weapon to sever his corporate career. Vanessa sat up straight, her calculating eyes darting toward the door as she realized I wasn't buying the performance. "You think a folder full of amateur forgeries is going to blind me to the rot inside this apartment?" I stepped into his personal space. "Dad, you're not thinking straight," Julian stammered, his polished facade cracking as he tried to regain his footing. "The illness is messing with your cognition. You're being paranoid. You need to go home and lie down before you do something you regret. Do you know what it feels like to look at the child you raised and see a parasite waiting for you to expire? It is a deafening, horrifying silence." I pulled out my smartphone, the sharp mechanical clicks sounding unnatural. "Why loud like a cocked pistol in the quiet room?" "I just authorized Sarah in accounting to freeze all of your corporate accounts and suspend your trust disbursements," I stated, tapping the screen deliberately. "You have exactly 24 hours to provide real, federal-level proof of Clara's theft, not these amateur forgeries. Otherwise, you will find yourself out on the street with absolutely nothing. I spent 40 years building this empire, and I will not let you turn it into a playground for a mistress and a coward." The trust was gone, the father was dead, only the CEO remained. Julian's mask shattered completely. His face contorted into an ugly, purple mask of rage, the thick veins in his neck bulging like cables as he lunged toward the island. "You can't do this to me," he shrieked, his voice cracking with high-pitched, entitled fury. "That money is my birthright. It belongs to me, not some runaway." I didn't even flinch. I turned my back on his tantrum and walked toward the heavy oak door. Vanessa remained perfectly still, a calculating snake quickly weighing the diminished net worth of the man screaming beside her. I didn't care. The stench of their entitlement was suffocating, and I needed to leave before I choked on it. As I stepped into the private elevator lobby, I heard the sharp crash of an espresso cup shattering violently against the wall. The heavy door clicked shut with a thud that felt like the final brick in a tomb, but Julian's final, venomous threat bled through the wood, vibrating like a curse. "Check your pulse, old man. You're already a walking ghost. You won't survive the winter to see me lose a dime." His parting words followed me down the elevator shaft, vibrating in the marrow of my bones. Standing in the mirrored box, I looked at my reflection. I looked old and weary, the skin under my eyes gray and sagging from the literal poison coursing through my veins. But my mind was sharpening into a deadly instrument. I realized then that Clara's disappearance wasn't just fear, it was a tactical retreat. She had gone into the shadows to protect the real evidence against him. Returning to Suite 55 at the Drake, the profound, plush silence was a stark contrast to the venomous shouting match at the penthouse. Clara was awake, sitting up in the massive bed. She looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the silk headboard, her eyes searching mine. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the physical weight of the morning pressing on my shoulders. I told her I had frozen Julian's access to the Empire. For the first time, a tiny spark of genuine relief broke through her haunted expression. "He will never stop, Arthur," she whispered, twisting the heavy silk sheets in her hands, her voice barely audible over the climate control. "He genuinely believes he owns the air I breathe." I placed my warm hand over hers, finding it cold but steady. "Then we are going to take the air back, Clara, starting with the money. Show me what you know." She asked me to hand her the small, battered canvas tote bag she had brought from the restaurant. It looked absurdly cheap and out of place amidst the velvet and gold of the suite. Reaching deep into a hidden seam in the lining, her fingers moving with practiced precision, she retrieved a slim, black leather-bound ledger. It smelled like old paper and dust. Opening it on the duvet, she guided my eyes through the numbers. She showed me exactly where $900,000 had been methodically drained from sterling innovations through dummy shell corporations I had never authorized. The numbers didn't lie. My son did. 900,000, I repeated, the number tasting like ash in my mouth. "He didn't just steal from the company, Clara. He stole from your future." My daughter-in-law had been acting as my silent guardian while I mistakenly thought she was a runaway. As she flipped to the back of the ledger, my stomach gave a sickening lurch. The margins were filled with sharp, aggressive handwriting that I recognized instantly. Vanessa Croft. She was the architect of the embezzlement long before she ever moved her suitcases into Julian's home. But it was a small, folded piece of paper tucked in the back cover that made the breath catch in my throat. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It was a printed receipt from an industrial chemical supply warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago. It was signed by Vanessa and dated exactly 2 weeks before my dizzy spells began. The ghost Julian claimed I was becoming now had a physical paper trail. It felt heavier than any steel beam I'd ever hoisted. Clara sat at the edge of the bed, her voice a hollow whisper as she confessed the final piece of the puzzle. She told me about a night she hid in the kitchen shadows, overhearing Julian and Vanessa. She watched Vanessa hand Julian a small glass vial filled with white powder, coldly explaining with clinical detachment that it would perfectly mimic the natural heart failure of a stressed, aging man, leaving no traceable forensic evidence if administered slowly. Clara had actually attempted to replace the vial with baking powder to buy me time, but Vanessa's paranoid eyes caught the texture difference within hours. That discovery was the terrifying catalyst that forced Clara to run into the night to save her own life. They called it the estate expediter, Arthur. Clara wept, her eyes fixed on the floor. They would joke and laugh about it while they stood in the kitchen brewing your afternoon tea. The brutal, nauseating clarity of her words struck me harder than any physical punch. My own son, the boy I taught to ride a bike, build models, and read a balance sheet, was casually stirring my grave into my cup every single day. The bitter, metallic tang I thought was just a side effect of stress was the taste of his betrayal. Is there a word for the exact moment you realize the person you give your life for is actively trying to take yours? I couldn't just sit there and be a victim. I needed to become a hunter. I quietly left the hotel and drove myself to a private medical facility to meet Dr. Harrison Cole, a 60-year-old toxicologist who possessed absolute clinical discretion and a fierce loyalty. I used the underground loading dock to avoid any cameras or tracking. The sterile, echoing, muffled silence of the empty lab was my sanctuary as Dr. Cole prepped the equipment. "Arthur, you look gray," Harrison muttered, his brow furrowed with genuine grave concern. "If what you suspect is true, we are operating on very little borrowed time." I didn't offer an explanation. I simply rolled up my sleeve without a word. The sharp, stinging scent of rubbing alcohol filled the air, followed by the cold, biting pressure of the tourniquet. The needle didn't hurt. The truth did. As the thick, dark, sluggish blood filled the glass vial, I felt a strange, empowering surge. I was extracting the physical manifestation of the poison, gathering the ammunition I needed to destroy Julian's glass-walled fortress. Harrison paused, noticing the ugly, dark purple bruising mapping my forearm, a clear indicator of internal organ stress. He traced it with a gloved finger. "Arthur," he whispered, staring at the sluggish blood, "if this is what I think it is, you shouldn't even be conscious, let alone standing right now." I didn't reply. I couldn't. I just stood there, a dying man finally finding the lethal focus required to finish a war he never wanted. Leaving the clinic, the ghost of Harrison's warning rode in the passenger seat with me. As I navigated the chaotic Chicago traffic, a sickening pattern crystallized in my mind. I realized that my worst, most debilitating episodes of weakness weren't random. They were meticulously timed, always striking exactly 12 hours before a major corporate board meeting. While I was stuck in bed, gasping for breath, Julian was standing at the head of my table, using his proxy power to authorize the very shell company transfers that were bleeding my legacy dry. I pulled up to an unmarked, nondescript brick building far from the polished financial district. Sarah Jenkins, a 50-year-old forensic accountant with a mind like a razor blade, didn't even offer a greeting or a handshake. She simply pointed to a chair, her eyes already glued to the scanned copies of Clara's ledger. "I want every single cent tracked, Sarah," I commanded, the blue light of her monitors highlighting my sunken cheeks. "I want to see the blood on the trail." Her fingers flew across the keyboard in a frantic, rhythmic clatter. "This isn't just basic theft, Arthur. This is the systematic, intentional erasure of your corporate assets. How do you rebuild a foundation when you're the one who hired the demolition crew?" Sarah's screen suddenly flashed with several red flags. She pulled up the payroll records for two junior executives, Jason Miller and Derek Shaw. I had personally fired them 6 months ago for gross financial negligence based on a dossier Julian handed me. Sarah cross-referenced their login IDs with the offshore transfers. Julian had stolen their administrative credentials and used them to move the $900,000 while the two men were off-site at a site visit. I felt violently ill. Jason had a toddler. Derek was paying off a massive mortgage. I had looked those innocent men in the eye and ruined their careers, completely fooled by my son's fabricated evidence. "He used them, Arthur," Sarah noted, her voice a clinical blade. "They were the sacrificial lamb so his offshore accounts could swell." But Sarah wasn't finished. She dug into the shell companies and discovered they weren't even in Julian's name. They were legally registered under Vanessa Croft's maiden name. She was the primary beneficiary, the puppet master holding all the strings to my son's greed. Then Sarah's face drained of color entirely, turning a ghastly shade of pale. She leaned close to the screen, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper of, the hum of the computer fans. Arthur, the money is just the appetizer. Look at this insurance addendum Julian filed 4 weeks ago. I stared at the digital document until the letters burned into my retinas. It was a corporate life insurance policy. Julian had used my digital biometric signature, likely lifting my thumbprint from my tablet while I lay in a drug-induced stupor during one of my recovery naps, to increase the accidental death and illness rider to a staggering $15 million. $15 million, I rasped, the words feeling like shards of glass grinding together in my throat. He couldn't even wait for nature to take its course. He's not waiting on nature, Arthur. He's accelerating the schedule, Sarah replied. I walked out of her office feeling like I was wading through waist-deep water. The iconic Chicago skyline, which I had spent decades helping to shape, looked like a row of jagged teeth waiting to snap shut on me. I returned to the Drake Hotel, my body vibrating with a dark, weary determination that bordered on the lethal. I needed to see Clara. I needed to look at the only pure thing left in the wreckage of the Sterling legacy. Entering Suite 55, the room was perfectly quiet. The rhythmic thrumming of the air conditioning was the only sound. I sat on the edge of the bed and quietly began reading a story aloud to calm her nerves, my voice a low, steady, gravelly rumble. Instinctively, I rested my hand gently on the side of her swollen stomach through the soft cotton robe. Suddenly, a sharp, powerful electric jolt of a kick struck my palm. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Did you feel that?" Clara whispered, a genuine, beautiful smile breaking through her exhaustion. "He's waking up." It was the very first time I had felt my grandson move. That tiny heel pressing against my hand felt infinitely more solid than any skyscraper foundation I had ever poured. "Hello there, Leo," I murmured, the name feeling like a sacred oath on my tongue. "Your grandpa isn't going anywhere. I promise you that." How can something so small overturn a lifetime of corporate cynicism? In that singular moment, my desire for mere survival morphed into a holy crusade. I wasn't just trying to outlive the poison anymore. I was going to burn Julian's world down to protect this child. I knew what I had to do. I had to let the arsenic do its job, or at least make Julian firmly believe it was working. I had to become the ghost he was waiting for. My phone rang, slicing through the peaceful silence. It was Dr. Cole. "It's arsenic, Arthur." Harrison's clinical voice crackled over the line, unable to hide his underlying tremor of alarm. "High purity, industrial-grade arsenic. Whoever is dosing you knows exactly how to keep you hovering right on the edge of death without pushing you over the line too soon." Harrison explained that Julian's fortified, special tea wasn't just laced with poison. It contained a powerful, odorless sedative designed to induce the brain fog that made me so susceptible to his financial suggestions. "Then they made a fatal mistake, Harrison," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion, a cold rasp. "They left me with just enough life to bury them." I initiated the aggressive, secret detox protocol Harrison prescribed, a series of chelating agents to flush the rot from my system. I spent the afternoon hiding the heavy metal detox pills inside my standard daily vitamin bottles. The first detox pill tasted like bitter chalk, but I welcomed it like a benediction. Every time I took my vitamins in front of Julian or my staff, I would be secretly healing my body while pretending to fade away. How much does a soul cost? Apparently, for Julian, it was $15 million. I stood in front of the ornate hallway mirror, physically practicing the slump of a dying man. I rehearsed the slight, pathetic slur of a tongue losing its grip on speech. Greed makes people incredibly sloppy when they think the finish line is in sight. By acting weaker than I truly was, I would force Julian to accelerate his crimes and leave a hurried trail of digital breadcrumbs. The next morning, I returned to my primary estate. The rhythmic, mocking chime of the doorbell echoed through the house. The monster had arrived. I slumped deep into my leather armchair in the study, letting my jaw hang slack and ensuring my hand shook violently against the armrest as I prepared to welcome my child into the room for our daily ritual of slow-motion murder. I heard Julian's confident, jaunty footsteps echoing on the hardwood. It used to be a sound that brought me joy. Today, it felt like a countdown. I kept my eyes half closed as he entered. I noticed he wasn't just carrying a silver tea tray. He had a small cardboard moving box under his arm. With chilling, psychopathic calm, he walked over to the far wall, picked up a framed photo of me and my late wife, and placed it face down in the box. He was actively erasing my presence from the room, while I was still drawing breath inside it. "You look terribly tired today, Dad," Julian cooed, his voice a sickening imitation of practiced concern. "Have you been taking your supplements?" "Everything feels so heavy, Julian," I wheezed, playing the hollowed-out victim perfectly. "My blood feels like thick lead." He offered a tight, soulless smile that didn't reach his eyes and set the tray on my mahogany desk. The delicate, mocking clink of the porcelain cups sounded like a judge's gavel. The bitter, earthy aroma of the poisoned Earl Grey wafted up, a scent designed to kill me. He pushed the cup with the distinct chipped rim toward me. Julian turned his back for exactly 3 seconds to adjust the heavy velvet drapes by the floor-to-ceiling windows, complaining about a draft. That was all the time I needed. Moving with a swift, silent, desperate speed that completely defied my supposed frailty, I switched our cups in a blurred motion. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs like a trapped bird. When he turned back, my hand was back to trembling over the handle of the safe cup. "Drink up, Arthur," Julian urged, casually using my first name with an arrogant familiarity, proving he already considered me a ghost. "Vanessa found this special blend. It's highly restorative." I watched unblinking as my son took a deep, satisfied gulp from the cup meant for me. He swallowed. He smiled. He had just signed his own confession with a sip. Because I had been secretly flushing the toxins from my system for days, I knew the heavy dose of sedative and inheritance accelerator would hit his pristine, unaccustomed system like a freight train. "I truly hope it is as effective as you say," I murmured, staring at the rim of his cup. As Julian stood up to leave, his knee buckled slightly. He caught himself on the edge of the desk, his eyes glazing over for a fraction of a second as the powerful sedative immediately began crossing his blood-brain barrier. I waited until the tail lights of his Audi vanished down the drizzle-soaked driveway before I grabbed my keys. The poetic irony of him drinking his own poison gave me a massive surge of grim energy. I drove straight to a subterranean parking garage near Independence Hall. The cold concrete cavern was thick with the scent of damp pavement and lingering exhaust. David Cross, a 52-year-old private investigator with weathered skin who specialized in corporate espionage, was waiting by a nondescript black sedan. He didn't offer a greeting, which I appreciated. We were way past the pleasantries of polite society. "Did you find the proof, David?" I asked, my voice echoing off the low ceiling. "Tell me she was sloppy." David handed me a glowing tablet, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light. "She thought she was a ghost, Arthur, but everyone leaves a footprint." Vanessa had used the stolen identity of Derek Shaw to purchase the chemicals, thinking she was burying the trail. But the surveillance footage on the tablet was undeniable. Even wearing a poorly fitted blonde wig and oversized dark glasses, Vanessa's distinct posture was obvious as she walked into the industrial chemical outlet. I watched her sign the electronic pad for a restricted batch of trioxide, smiling at the clerk like a charming, lethal viper. "That's her," I confirmed, a knot of disgust tightening in my stomach. She used my own company credit card to buy the poison. It gets worse, David rumbled, swiping to the next file. She's not just buying chemicals. She's been secretly making inquiries about quick estate liquidations, and she's been meeting with a lawyer specializing in international non-extradition. They are preparing to pack their bags the moment your heart stops. The game was accelerating. I didn't wait for the garage door to fully rise before I sped out. I drove back to the Drake Hotel and immediately initiated my extraction plan. I had Samuel drive the hotel's luxury town car straight to O'Hare Airport and abandon it in long-term parking, creating a decoy to make Julian and Vanessa believe Clara and I had fled the state. Under the cover of a late-night laundry delivery, hidden beneath a pile of white linens in a cart, I smuggled Clara out the back service doors. We switched to an unmarked sedan and drove to my Gold Coast mansion, a massive, historic limestone fortress I kept completely off the corporate books for decades. Julian hadn't set foot there since his mother's funeral. It was a blind spot in his radar. As the heavy iron gates locked shut behind us with a comforting clack, Clara's shoulders finally dropped. I had secretly commissioned a sunroom to be converted into a fully stocked nursery. The scent of lavender and fresh paint hung in the air. "It's beautiful, Arthur," she cried softly, trailing her fingers over the edge of the mahogany crib. "It smells like safety." Watching her face was the only payment I needed. Meanwhile, Julian was currently miles away, tearing through the dangerous, damp slums of the South Side. I had intentionally leaked a fake tip through Richard's network that a pregnant woman matching Clara's description was working at a 24-hour diner down there. David sent me live drone footage of Julian frantically searching the filthy alleyways, his expensive designer coat ruined by the sleet. Does a father ever truly stop feeling the sting of his child's failure? But as I watched the feed, my blood ran cold. Julian wasn't just looking for Clara. The footage showed him handing a thick envelope of cash to a known local gang enforcer in a back alley handoff. Julian was hiring a hitman. He wanted Clara permanently erased to tie up loose ends before the baby could complicate his inheritance. I turned off the monitor, the silence of the mansion suddenly feeling heavy like a shroud. That silence was shattered by a sharp, agonizing scream from the hallway. I sprinted out of the study to find Clara clutching the grand staircase banister, her face completely drained of blood. A puddle of amniotic fluid stained the floor. "Arthur," she gasped, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "It's time." The stress, the minor carside encounter she had earlier, the sheer terror of the past month had finally triggered premature labor. We were weeks early. I grabbed the pre-packed hospital bag, my mind racing through the logistics of the VIP protocol I had set up at Northwestern Memorial. "Just breathe, Clara. I've built towers in the middle of blizzards. We can handle a baby in the rain," I commanded softly, trying to project a calm I absolutely did not feel. But as I helped her toward the heavy oak front doors, leaning her weight against my shoulder, I saw it. A tiny, faint red laser dot was dancing erratically across the silk wallpaper of the entryway, moving with predatory grace. Julian's hired scout hadn't been fooled by the airport decoy. They had found the Gold Coast mansion. The shadow was no longer at the gate, it was inside the perimeter. "Samuel, take the alley exit. No headlights," I roared into my encrypted phone, shoving Clara down into the shadows of the hallway. This wasn't just a medical emergency anymore. It was an extraction from an active kill zone. The heavy doors of the armored SUV slammed shut, and Samuel floored it out of the darkened back lane. I threw my body over Clara's in the backseat as she screamed through a massive, bone-crushing contraction. Samuel drove with tactical precision, executing violent, illegal turns through the narrow Chicago cobblestone streets to shake the dark sedan tailing us. The smell of burning rubber and cold rain filled the cabin. "Lose them, Samuel," I yelled, my poisoned heart pumping pure adrenaline. "Stay down, boss," he barked back, ripping the wheel hard to the left, narrowly missing a parked delivery truck and successfully breaking their line of sight. We screeched into the restricted underground secondary ambulance bay at Northwestern Memorial. The reinforced steel gates slid open only after Samuel flashed a specific security badge. Dr. Carter and a discreet swarm of nurses were already sprinting toward the vehicle with a gurney, the wheels making a rhythmic thud. Clara's hand gripped mine with terrifying strength. "She's fully dilated. Move," I shouted, the urgency clawing at my throat. The doors to the secure maternity ward hissed shut, leaving me standing alone in the sterile hallway. Samuel quietly leaned into the window and handed me a burner phone he had confiscated from the scout lurking near the gate. I checked the call logs. The last outgoing call wasn't to Julian. It was to Vanessa Croft. Vanessa was running her own shadow operation. She wanted the baby for leverage, and she wasn't even telling Julian. I paced the waiting room, the rhythmic beeping of the fetal monitor bleeding through the heavy doors. For 2 agonizing hours, I listened to Clara give everything she had left to bring a new life into this broken world. Finally, at 3:17 a.m., a sharp, indignant wail echoed through the corridor. When Dr. Carter waved me into the room, my legs felt like water. But as she placed the tiny, blue-swaddled infant into my arms, a massive surge of pure, physical vitality washed over me. The symptoms of the toxin vanished momentarily. Leo Sterling weighed 6 pounds 3 oz of absolute defiance. "He looks like hope," I whispered, looking down at his dark, serious eyes. But the tender moment was obliterated when the confiscated burner phone in my pocket vibrated violently. I pulled it out. It was a high-resolution photo sent via text. It showed the exact ambulance bay we had just used, with my SUV clearly idling in the frame. My sanctuary was breached. I stepped out into the hall. One of my loyal executives, Sarah, quietly rushed up to me holding her tablet. "Arthur, look. A concerned citizen just posted this photo to a massive Chicago gossip blog. They are speculating about an emergency birth in the VIP wing." Julian's spies hadn't just found us. They were weaponizing public social media to trap us. The photo angle was perfect, taken by a bribed hospital night shift guard. The phone in my hand buzzed again. An incoming call. I answered it. "I hope you're savoring your last few hours of grandfatherhood, Dad." Julian's voice sneered through the speaker, utterly devoid of filial concern. "I've already filed an emergency ex parte custody order. With Clara's documented disappearance and her mental instability, a judge will hand that boy to me." "You will have to step over my corpse to touch that bassinet, Julian," I growled, my voice a low, lethal vibration. Julian laughed, a jagged, manic sound. "That can be arranged. Vanessa says the arsenic is just the appetizer. She has a copy of your preliminary blood work from Dr. Cole's lab. Did you really think your doctor's security was safe? We know you're dying. Say goodbye to the kid, old man." The line clicked dead. Julian thought he held all the cards, but he didn't realize I had already rewritten the rules of the game. I retreated to my study under heavy private security and initiated my final, devastating counterstrike. I secretly transferred 49% of my personal voting shares into an irrevocable, ironclad trust in baby Leo's name. Even if Julian somehow murdered me and seized the CEO chair, he would be eternally blocked by the voting block of the very infant he viewed as a pawn. Sarah Jenkins arrived carrying a massive, heavy forensic binder. "The trap is set, Arthur. Every cent is tracked. The offshore accounts traced directly to Vanessa's biometric signature, and the forged insurance papers have Julian's digital fingerprints all over them." I pulled out my phone and drafted a short, clinical text to Julian. "Meet me at the Drake Hotel, Suite 55 at noon. Bring Vanessa. We need to discuss a final financial settlement for the baby's future." I knew his boundless greed would override his caution. He wouldn't be able to resist the lure of my corporate surrender. I coordinated with Detective Larson, a hard-nosed veteran of the Financial Crimes Unit. We wired Suite 55 with hidden cameras and directional microphones. Larson and two armed, uniformed officers waited silently in the adjoining master bedroom. At exactly noon, the heavy mahogany doors of the suite swung open. Julian strutted in with Vanessa clinging to his arm. They both radiated a sickening aura of unearned victory and triumph. Julian looked incredibly smug, clearly believing he was walking in to collect my empire. I didn't stand up. I remained seated behind the ornate, massive mahogany desk, intentionally letting my left hand tremble slightly in the light. I had ordered massive arrangements of stargazer lilies for the room. Their overpowering, cloying sweet scent was specifically chosen because I knew Vanessa was mildly allergic to them. I watched with quiet, clinical satisfaction as her nose crinkled in irritation. "You look remarkably alive today, Dad," Julian smirked, dropping into a velvet chair, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Let's get this paperwork signed so you can finally rest. You've fought hard enough." "The only thing being put to rest today, Julian, is your delusion of inheritance," I replied, my voice dropping the frail act entirely. It resonated with a deep, steady rasp. I reached into my desk and threw the medical toxicology report across the polished wood. The dry, papery sound echoed loudly. It slid to a halt right in front of them. The bold red letters at the bottom read, "Lethal intent confirmed via systematic heavy metal dosage." Vanessa's hand shot out, her fingers trembling, desperately trying to snatch the paper away. I lunged forward and caught her wrist with a sudden, iron-like strength that completely shattered the illusion of my failing health. I watched the blood instantly drain from her face. Julian stared at the report, his jaw dropping as the horrifying reality dawned on him. I wasn't the ghost. He was the prey. "You think this proves anything?" Julian stammered, his arrogant smirk dissolving into a panicked, shrill laugh. "You're a senile old fool. No court will believe the delusions of a dying man." I silenced his pathetic, stuttering excuses by slamming the massive forensic audit binder onto the desk. The thud sounded like a gavel striking a final judgment. I methodically walked him through the $900,000 money trail, showing him the exact timestamps where he used my chemically induced dizzy spells to forge my digital signatures on wire transfers. The arrogant posture withered and melted off his frame. He suddenly smelled of sharp, stale sweat and sheer panic. He realized he wasn't looking at a family dispute. He was staring down the barrel of a massive federal indictment that I had personally financed. "Every dollar you stole has a heartbeat, Julian," I said, my voice as cold as the marble in a mausoleum. "And yours just stopped." Desperation clawed at his face. He lunged across the desk. "Where is the baby? Give me the boy and the company and I'll burn these reports. If you send me to prison, your grandson grows up in poverty." It was a coward's bargain. "You want Leo?" I stood up, my towering frame casting a long shadow over him. "You don't even know the color of his eyes. You only know the weight of his inheritance." Furthermore, Clara filed an emergency protection affidavit while still at the hospital, legally stripping you of all immediate parental rights. You have nothing. Julian roared, his face twisting into something demonic. He charged toward the master bedroom door, convinced the baby was hidden behind it. I didn't move a single muscle to stop him. His hand grabbed the brass handle. Instantly, the door ripped open from the inside. The sharp, mechanical clack of 3 service weapons being unholstered echoed through the opulent suite's silence. Detective Larson stepped out of the shadows, his badge gleaming against his chest, flanked by 2 grim-faced uniformed officers. "Julian Sterling, step away from the door and keep your hands visible," Larson ordered, his voice echoing like thunder. Julian froze, his eyes darting wildly from the barrels of the guns to my face. The game was over. I watched with absolute, cold detachment as the officers forced my son to his knees on the plush Regency carpet. The blue and red flicker of police lights from the street outside reflected against the gold leaf ceiling. The harsh click of the steel handcuffs ratcheting shut around his wrists was the final note of 36 years of fatherhood. He began to weep hysterically, babbling apologies and trying to throw Vanessa under the bus. It was her idea. She brought the powders. I was just trying to protect the firm. Save I. Tea for the judge, Julian, I said, turning my back on him. Every word he screamed only added another year to his federal sentence. But as the officers hauled Julian to his feet, I realized the room felt strangely lighter. During the chaotic distraction of the arrest, Vanessa Croft had slipped out through the catering service door. The lingering, suffocating scent of her floral perfume was the only trace she left behind. "She's gone, Arthur," David Cross's voice crackled over the radio on the desk. "She bypassed the security detail using a service elevator override we didn't account for." I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, a new spike of cold alarm replacing my victory. I noticed Vanessa had left her designer manila envelope behind. I ripped it open. Taped inside the lining was a small, blinking GPS tracker. She didn't run for the airport. She had cloned my location data. She was heading straight for the Gold Coast mansion to grab the baby. I bolted from the room, leaving the police to process my son. I threw myself into the back of my SUV, screaming at Samuel to drive. The screech of tires echoed as we tore off. The sirens of the police cruisers faded into the distance, replaced by the deafening roar of my own heartbeat. We careened into the driveway of the mansion, just as a dark sedan smashed through the secondary iron gate. A gate I had intentionally instructed Samuel to leave unlatched as a honeypot trap to lure her in. Vanessa stepped out of her car, looking like a deranged, cornered animal, clutching a heavy tire iron. But before she could even take 3 steps toward the front door, 4 unmarked police cruisers materialized from the dark tree line, flooding the driveway with blinding red and blue strobe lights. She dropped the iron. The fight completely left her body. She realized the perimeter wasn't breached by her brilliance. It was a net I had laid out specifically for her, ensuring she was caught in the act of attempted kidnapping. As the officers slammed her against the hood of the cruiser and cuffed her in steel restraints, she glared at me with wild, venomous eyes. "This city belongs to the Sterlings, Arthur. We were just the current residents." "You underestimated the foundation, Vanessa," I replied calmly. I watched the cruiser drive away into the night, taking the poison out of my life forever. The profound, heavy silence that settled over the mansion was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The air no longer tasted like betrayal and heavy metals. It tasted like a future. The next morning, I walked into the glass atrium of Sterling Innovations. The building felt different. It felt like a battlefield I was finally ready to clean. I convened an emergency meeting of the board of directors at exactly 10:00 a.m. I didn't seek consensus. I delivered a verdict. Using the documents recovered from Vanessa's files, I exposed 3 senior board members who had been taking kickbacks to look the other way while Julian drained the accounts. I forced their immediate resignations on the spot, purging the deep-rooted rot from my empire in a matter of hours. That afternoon at 2:00 p.m., I called Jason Miller and Derek Shaw into the marble lobby. They walked in clutching their briefcases like shields, expecting legal threats. Instead, I handed them each a cool, heavy settlement envelope and senior management contracts. "I didn't just bring you back for your accounting skills, Jason," I told him, watching the shock turn to restore dignity in their eyes. "I brought you back for your honor." 6 months later, I sat in the polished courtroom, the blinding, honest afternoon sun streaming through the high glass windows. Julian stood before the judge in a federal jumpsuit. He attempted to blame his upbringing for his crimes, but the prosecutor revealed that I had actually set up a secret scholarship trust fund in his name decades ago, a fund he had been siphoning from since his college days. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. As the bailiffs led him away, Julian stopped and locked eyes with me. "You're still a sterling dad," he hissed, his voice a ragged shadow of the one that used to laugh at my table. "You just traded a son for a stranger's baby." I didn't answer. I simply watched him go, severing the final tie to a version of myself I no longer recognized. Later that week, standing in the sunlit study of the Gold Coast mansion at sunset, I handed Clara a thick stack of legal documents. "I have officially finalized the adult adoption paperwork, Clara," I said, watching her eyes widen in shock. "You are legally a sterling by law now. You hold a permanent, unchallengeable voting seat on the board." I also handed her the master digital key to the newly formed Department of Internal Audit and Ethics. She sat behind the desk with a confidence forged in the fire of her survival. "I won't let them down, Arthur," she promised. The final piece of healing occurred a month later, at a massive charity gala I hosted at the Bellevue to launch the Sterling Ethics Foundation. I had secretly dispatched my private jet to the mountains of Kentucky to locate Clara's estranged parents, Thomas and Mary Hayes. Julian had blackmailed them with fake legal threats to stay away from Clara. When Thomas, a humble man with hands like cracked leather, and Mary walked into the opulent ballroom, Clara froze. The high society mask shattered. The champagne glass in her hand trembled. The reunion was a visceral collision of Kentucky warmth and Chicago marble, a masterpiece of raw, unfiltered love, far more valuable than any real estate deal I had ever closed. Now I sit on a quiet, sun-baked park bench near Lake Michigan. The autumn breeze is crisp and clean. Clara is walking slightly ahead with her parents, laughing freely. I am holding little Leo in my lap. He reaches up with a tiny, uncoordinated hand and grips my index finger with surprising strength. "He's got your stubbornness," Clara laughs softly. "Good," I whisper. I look down at his wrist, and there, faintly visible in the folds of his skin, is a birthmark shaped exactly like a cornerstone, the exact same mark my own father carried. It is a quiet, miraculous confirmation that the foundation of this family is finally secure. I pull out a heavy, leather-bound journal. It contains the technical keys to a blockchain trust fund that will unlock for Leo when he turns 25. But more importantly, it contains my story. "To my grandson," I write, the pen gliding smoothly over the paper without a single tremor. "Never trust a structure that doesn't account for the soul. The greatest thing I ever built was the bridge back to this family." Reflecting on this grueling, arsenic-laced journey, I realized my fatal flaw was spending decades building a corporate empire while utterly neglecting to build a relationship and moral foundation for my son. I gave him endless wealth but failed to teach him character. This entire ordeal wasn't about revenge. It was a desperate, necessary act of survival to protect an innocent child from the monster I inadvertently raised under my own roof. If there is a lesson to be learned here, it is this: always verify the trust you place in others, even your own blood. Your closest circle can easily become your greatest threat if you prioritize profits over genuine people. I believe a higher power allowed me to see the rot in my life just in time to cut it out. Sometimes, God doesn't just save us from our enemies, He saves us from the mistakes of our own making. Thank you for walking with me through this entire, incredible journey. I genuinely want to hear your perspective. What would you have done if you discovered your own child was slowly trying to end your life for money? Would you choose revenge, forgiveness, or something in between? Your viewpoint truly matters to me. If this narrative moved you, or made you reflect on the true value of loyalty and family, please consider subscribing to this channel so you won't miss our future explorations of trust, betrayal, and ultimate redemption. Remember, While this story is dramatized to highlight the profound themes of corporate greed and family survival, the emotional truths within it are universal. If this style of storytelling isn't your preference, please feel free to browse our other videos to find the perfect fit for you. Stay safe, and always build your foundations on truth.